So I'm very interested in finding women in Nevada's mining industry, and in talking about the mining industry. Of course, we all think of prospecting and mining and extraction, and that certainly is represented here by Belle Butler on the left. Out of curiosity, can you see my cursor moving around? I see nodding. Great, yay, I can use that. So here's Belle on the left, and she made the discovery and staked the claim that became the Mizpah mine outside of Tonopah, which was the most fabulous silver mine in that early part of the 20th century. But the mining industry also includes what we now call the supply chain, the services that support a mining enterprise. And down here we see some women standing in front of the laundry at Rawhide in 1908. It's interesting, all the men are standing in the bread line and all the women are watching them, but I think that might be something to discuss at a later time. So my interest in all of this really comes from my experience in this particular mining town in northern Nevada. This is Midas. I've been wandering around this place since 1969. I currently have the great fortune of living here full time. And in the process, I got to talk to a lot of women who grew up here, who lived here when it was booming. It's now mostly a retirement and recreation community. And they piqued my interest on what it was like to live in this. It is still very remote, at the end of a 30-mile dirt road, but it used to be even more remote. And so I started looking around to see what I could find. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So it can be very hard to find women in the mining industry, and this is a great illustration of that. Rawhide in 1907. You look at this line, and pretty much all you see are men. But if we look closely, we can find one woman here in the center, standing here waiting to get her mail at the new mining town of Rawhide. But there was a particularly good reason why it's difficult to find women in mining history and in Nevada history in general. When you look at the population, the ratio of men to women according to each census, you can see the blue line is men and the orange line is women. And 1870, which is right after the Comstock period, there were roughly one woman for every three men. And it takes a long time. We're well into the 20th century before we see that sort of a 50-50 split in the gender ratios. The area that I'm interested in is 1890 to 1950, essentially. And as you can see, even though the numbers are going down, men still significantly outnumber women. But we can find them, and we're going to start looking for them. So first, I want to talk about the women who are involved in direct roles in mining, who are prospectors and miners. And this fabulous photo, we don't know where this mine is. We don't know who these folks are. We don't know why she's sitting in an ore cart, but it is one of those wonderful images of women at a mine in the early 20th century Nevada. The quote comes from Mame Schwebel, who was a prospector and a mine owner. She ran for the Nevada Assembly in 1924 and was elected the first woman miner, essentially, to be elected to the Nevada legislature. And I'm pretty certain she's the only woman who put prospector as her occupation, certainly as an elected legislator, and quite possibly may have been the last prospector in the legislature, serving that late into the 20th century. And I'm assuming that somebody in this audience has a muck stick in their collection, and I would love to see it. Certainly, I'm assuming you all know what it's used for, so we're just going to keep going on forward. So we're going to talk about women as prospectors. And on my screen, the top part of this title has been cut off, so hopefully you can still see it. But it's the women prospector found gold in Alaska and Nevada. And in Nevada newspapers in the early part of the 20th century, but starting around 1935 and through 1945, started featuring a lot more women in the mining pages of the Reno Evening Gazette and the Nevada State Journal. This is Mrs. C.D. Preble, It was printed in the Reno paper in 1943, and she was credited with finding quite a bit of gold around Goldfield. I assume by the Joshua trees in this picture that this photo may have been taken there, but she soon left and faded into history. We don't even know what CD stands for. But another prospector who showed up about the same time is this woman, Helen Seifert, and the newspaper identifies her as a prospector. She was known colloquially as Klondike Helen, and not because she worked in the Klondike in Alaska and Canada, but because that was the name of her mine. And as I understand it, that was kind of a generous term. Helen was known for doing a lot of prospecting, but not necessarily a lot of production. And she was out near Silver Peak, which currently is the site of the only lithium mine in the state of Nevada. And she would do a lot of, she would primarily walk between Tonopah and Silver Peak, which is about 20 miles. And when the reporter asked her, why is she walking? She said, well, the car broke down. She had a car. It gave her fits. It finally broke down out in Death Valley, and she thought it was better for it if it stayed out in Death Valley, and she would just continue to walk. She was in the area for years, but we don't know if she ever did much beyond prospecting. There are other women who appear under the title of prospector. The photo on the right, in the museum, it's marked as a publicity stunt that these women were panning in an area that had recently had some discoveries. And so the woman on the right is Vivian Pike. She was a teacher in Winnemucca. And the woman with the fabulous headdress there is Meg Coombs, and she was the secretary to Mrs. Pike's brother. He had found some promising ore, did a little bit of speculating, trying to sell some claims, trying to sell some lots in the area. But these women look way too serious for this to have been a publicity stunt, although I think prospecting in heels and pantyhose may not be the easiest thing to do. The photo on the left is of National. Again, we don't know exactly what this woman is doing, but it's at the very beginning of the discoveries in 1907. A few years later, this newspaper article appears in the Reno Evening Gazette, and the newspapers tend to put an adjective in front of prospector or miner if it was a woman, which certainly makes it easier now if we're doing word searching, which is a wonderful new tool for research. But woman prospector is finder of rich ore. And the article goes on to say that it's a little derogatory, actually, that, all these guys were out looking, but it was left to a woman to actually make the discovery that made the district viable. But reading down in the article, it notes that she wasn't just somebody who just wandered out in the desert. She'd actually been prospecting for many years, and she knew what she was doing, that she had studied the mining industry. She knew how to read the geology of the area, how to read the terrain, and that's how she was able to make this very rich discovery. National didn't last very long, so while it may have been a rich discovery in the beginning, it was not one that kept things moving. Prospectors were very intriguing to reporters and to newspaper writers, and certainly formed the basis of Sally Zanjani's book, which I'm certain everyone has read, A Mine of Her Own, about prospectors in the American West. But looking at doing the word searching again, we can find women miners, and this wonderful photo of May Williams is headlined as miner, and you can see that May is probably wearing a dress, and she has her equipment with her. And it's a very long article about May and how she got into the mining industry. The article was written by Ethel Parker. Ethel was married to a metallurgist, and while her husband was literally working in the mining industry, Ethel was out exploring for stories, and we have Ethel to thank for saving some really remarkable stories, such as this story about May Williams. And so she asked May how she happened to become involved in mining. And May explained, she didn't say exactly why she happened to be in Tonopah in the very early boom years around 1901, 1902. But she said that she was there and she started watching the stock market, the Tonopah stock market. And she was watching how people were buying and selling, primarily men were buying and selling mining claims. And she taught herself the business. So she started buying stock in promising mining companies, selling that stock, and eventually made enough money that she bought her own mine. And this is a mine that was located not far from Tonopah, that she worked then for many years. This was published in 1938, well after Tonopah had faded, but she had been working out there all this time. And the newspaper reporters, even Ethel, found it necessary to comment to readers about the femininity of these miners. So yes, these women were doing rough work and they were wearing rough clothing. But I'm going to read you how Ethel finished this article. She said, "But while she is a miner, she is also a woman, and when the occasion demands, can be as feminine as any of the most discriminating of her sex. Upon those occasions, when attired in a filmy evening dress, you would never guess that perhaps during the day, she had been mucking out waste material down in 100-foot shaft. Such are the activities of a woman miner's day." I'm not certain we would find May Williams in an evening dress, but it was important for readers to understand that while these women were doing unusual work, they were still very much a woman. May Williams, not long after this article was written, May demonstrated that the hazards of mining could affect women just as much as men. And as you can see here, she fell off of a ladder in the shaft, broke her hip, also broke her leg, and these injuries led to her death right at the end of October. And on her death certificate, which is, every death certificate notes the occupation of the person that it's recording. It says housewife, and then you can see somebody has added in and miner. She clearly had worked as a miner nearly her entire life, and that was recorded on her death certificate. Again, this is a wonderful tools that we did not have before, where we can do search for death certificates and word search in newspapers, and really get a very different picture of women's lived experiences in the American West, but certainly in Nevada in the 20th century. So using that phrase, woman miner, some other interesting things pop up in the Reno newspaper. The earliest mention that I could find of a woman miner was this article in the Elko Independent about a woman in Montana who Montana has a curiosity in the shape of a mine that's owned by a woman, and probably the only one in the West, they're assuming. And you see that in many articles, that this is the only one. But now we have the advantage of being able to look at articles across a geographic area and discover that actually, no, they really weren't the only ones. The article on the right from 1947 is a woman here in Elko County who was also a doctor. And we see that a lot with women miners, that they have other occupations as well. And then, of course, I have to continue to throw in stories about the women from the town that I now live in. Luella Pendergast was appointed Justice of the Peace here in Midas in 1943. But she was a miner near Tuscarora. Her claims were at the Falcon Mine, which are currently being reopened, which I think is kind of interesting. the census that's referred to at the top of this slide, I have not been able to find the census. I'm not entirely certain what they're referring to, but to go through and count 100 women who are actually engaged in the mining industry in Nevada is really quite remarkable for 1940. So I'm going to talk about some specific women, give you some bios. This is from Rob McQueen's area. If you saw his virtual tour of the Mill Creek area, there was a woman who mined there for several years who was born a slave in Louisiana. We're not certain how she got to Nevada, but she was here. She was on the Comstock by 1876. And by the early 1880s, she was operating a boarding house out by Cortez in the Mill Creek area. But she also grub-staked miners, and she acquired mining claims, perhaps in the same way that Eiley Bowers did when she connected with Sandy Bowers in the Comstock. But Maggie accumulated quite a few claims. And in looking at the Eureka newspaper, there are plenty of recordings of where she bought and sold mining claims. And by the 1900 Nevada census, she is listed as owning a mine. And in the 1910 census, she's the only woman who owns a silver mine in the 1910 census, but she is not the only woman who owns a mine. We have Rose McDonald, Rose O'Connor in 1910 owned a gold mine down by Searchlight outside of Las Vegas. And this is one of my favorite stories. Her claims were the homestake claims. It's not entirely clear whether she actually had a shaft or something like that, but she came back from shopping in Las Vegas and found two men trying to jump her claim, so she shot them and then loaded them in her car and drove them to Las Vegas, turned them in, turned herself in. As you can see here, that one was killed and one was hurt. She went on trial in Las Vegas. It was the first murder trial in the new courthouse in Las Vegas, and was eventually acquitted. And I'm not entirely certain if she was acquitted because the idea of a woman actually shooting men was still difficult for a jury to wrap its head around, or if it's because it was considered a defense of her own property. She continued to mine in the area for many years. And when she died in 1952, her death certificate also noted that her occupation was as a miner. So mining towns really depended a lot on women in terms of providing services. And in this particular town, which you can just probably see it right here at the bottom, it's Wamoni, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm not entirely certain. It didn't actually turn into anything. But these two women have arrived at the discovery and they've set up the first gas station. And unfortunately, we don't know their names, but the quote comes from Mary Walker Foster, and I'll get to her here in a minute, but Mary was widowed in Ely when it was booming early in the 20th century, and she told her biographer later on that a mining town is a wonderful place for a widow to be because there is always work to be had. There's always a job that can be done. And she just thought that these were marvelous places for women. So looking at some of the roles that women filled in these mining towns. On the left, we have Daisy Allen, who was taking the census at Belmont in 1900. She operated a hotel, a boarding house at Fairview when it was first booming. She ended up in Fallon running a hotel there and was also an assemblywoman elected from Churchill County to represent them in 1925. To her right is Maud Reed, who was the postmaster at Gold Reed in 1905. She also ran a store, and I'm not entirely certain if this tent is her store or the post office, but highly likely it was both. And at the bottom, two of my favorite mining women. On the left, Irene True, who is the tall woman that you can just barely see with the hat. She ran a stage, not a stage coach, but a stage, driving this sort of large car between Winnemucca and Midas, where I live now, in the 1930s. So she would bring supplies into Midas and bring the mail. And then she would carry the ore sacks out that were being produced at a couple of the small mines around here. She also, and this is the only, when we talk about women in mining towns, there's an obvious occupation that many people think of. And this is the only time I'm going to mention the obvious occupation. But Irene owned the brothel in Midas for several years till she sold it to another woman. And then she owned a brothel in Winnemucca for many years after that. On the right is, let's go back to, well, now I've done it. So before that was Dr. Young, the woman who was wearing the pants. She was a dentist and also a mining reporter and also a town speculator. But the computers decided I'm going to tell you about Josephine Guyman. And since I'm about out of time, I want to go to Josephine anyway. This particular photo here of the two-story building started out as a mercury mill and then became a cyanide mill. It was built in 1908, and it was in most of the records called the Charles Guyman Mill. But in those conversations that I had with people who grew up in Midas in the 1920s and 30s, they remembered that it was a woman who ran this mill. And, a lot of legal records and property records are under men's names and very rarely under women's names. But being able to do some word searching in newspapers, I found that Charles and Josephine lived in Butte, Montana, before they came to Nevada. And he very rarely came to Midas. According to the newspaper, he was in Butte most of the time. But and Josephine was certainly qualified to run this mill and to supervise the men who worked here, because in 1905, as you can see from the newspaper clippings on the left, Charles was arrested. He was in jail. It was a dispute with a large mining company who was interested in his Yankee Boy claims, but they had 50 men working at the mine and the mill, and she kept it running. And that just fascinated the nation. The photo on the top comes from Indiana. This drawing comes from Indiana. The photo of the very feminine woman with the bonnet comes from Pittsburgh. And their articles are essentially the same, talking about how hard she worked in the mine and how hard she worked in the mill. She did say the only mining activity that she never could get skilled at was working a shovel, which I found kind of fascinating. But I think it's because she wasn't very tall. When these same articles appeared in Kansas, the headline was "Woman Wears Man's Clothing." And was not quite so focused on her skills as a miner and mill operator. But she operated this mill well into the 1920s. It appears that she sold it in the early 1930s when she finally left Midas. And then to Mary Walker, who I mentioned earlier. This is a photo that Mary took because she became a mining photographer. And here she is with federal mine inspectors in Churchill County, where she would go underground and photograph mines that had been apparently abandoned for federal records. These are all from the Summit King mine in Churchill County. And I find them rather terrifying to look at, but she said that she never had any fear about going into these mines. And they relied on her for many years to take photos of these abandoned mines for the federal government. And I see that I am running short on time, which works out great because I only have a couple of slides left. I do want to give a shout out to two of the best resources about women in mining. One, of course, is Sally Zanjani's book about prospectors. The other is the book edited by Ron James and Liz Raymond about women in a mining community. On the one Sally's book is about women in direct roles in mining, and Ron and Liz's book is about women building a community. And I was really interested, I'm still interested in how those things intersect, how they come together. And so my first exploration of that was in a quarterly article that came out earlier this year, looking at women working in the mining district that I currently live in. And I'm going to make a plug for the Northeastern Nevada Historical Society Quarterly, which is kind of hard to say all at once. But we are always looking for articles about Northeastern Nevada. If any of you are interested in producing something about some mining history article for the quarterly, be sure and give me a shout. I know I've got Rob McQueen in the queue, and would definitely love to see articles by anybody who's interested in this corner of the US West. And so with that, I will say thank you with these two women who are students at the Mackey School of Mines in the 1950s, and they were out on a field trip. Unfortunately, we don't know who they are, but it's a marvelous way to say thank you for this opportunity to talk about these women who fascinate me, and I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Well, thank you, Dana. There we go.
Thanks.
Yes, questions. Don't be shy.
I feel like I raced through them really quickly.
Well, I'll lead us off with questions then. Dana, just a delightful presentation here. Such rich material you've unearthed here, and I think this is just terrific. But I really appreciate your highlighting some of the new sources that are available these days. That, for example, the work of Sally, just to name one, wouldn't have been able to access. One of the things that made the James and Raymond Comstock Women book so amazing was their really early use of that digitized census material and things of that nature. But I just wondered, like, if you had any sense of, I can recognize some of the patterns, knowing sort of some of your research interests, Midas being an obvious one, but I wondered if you had any sense of, like, how do you make this a little bit bigger? What are, like, natural boundaries for a story like this? Is it, could you do a history of women in Nevada? Is there something different from women's experience in Nevada versus following the boom towns from place to place? Like, would it make more sense to follow individuals or occupations, or look at particular time periods? Like, what's the best way, do you think, to really kind of tackle going forward with a project like this? I'm just curious what you think.
Well, thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. And I think there's several different ways we could go. One of the things that struck me when I was getting ready for this evening was how mobile these women were at a time that we don't think about people being mobile. And it's actually applies to mining communities and mining towns, I think, in general. It's not just men or just women, but these folks were mobile. So Dr. Young, who I accidentally, shot off the screen so quickly, was from Colorado. She was from Cripple Creek, and she ended up in Nevada with some other Cripple Creek miners, and became a town speculator. So there are these intersections that I think are not restricted to state boundaries. In terms of time, really, it's the early 20th century that I think has the richest material, and part of that may be, suffrage was a major political movement in the early part of the 20th century. Perhaps women felt more comfortable in taking on some of these roles. But their geographic, I guess, political boundaries can't be ignored, because many of the states around Nevada had laws that prohibited women from working in mines. Nevada never had that law, but other states did. And so I think in that context, maybe some of these women saw an opportunity in Nevada that they couldn't have in Utah, or I think Arizona. It was illegal in Arizona. So that's a really long-winded way of saying, no, I don't think there's any clear distinction, but there's some really interesting patterns.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'll have a comment about your Irene True. I'm just wondering if she is any relation to the Bisbee Trues. It's a True family. I forget which of the big mines in Bisbee. Some Trues were involved there.
So like many of the women that I've chased through some of these stories, Irene's origins are a little cloudy, and it's not clear. Part of the challenge with researching women's lives is names change all the time, and spellings can be difficult, and it's hard to find some of the early information. So Irene had a very complicated last name that I'm not even going to attempt to say. And it's not clear whether it was her original name or whether it was another marriage, but she married a man named Curtis True, and it was an unusual spelling, Courtes, who was in Winnemucca. I haven't run across any connection with Bisbee, but again, with the way folks moved around, it's possible. But Irene was a very, very colorful character. She actually shot that car when it gave up on her. She was driving into Midas, and there's the main road into Midas at the time came down a hill. She got to the top of the hill, the car gave out. It had been causing problems for a long time. So she got out and hollered it until somebody paid attention, and people walked up the hill and carried all the groceries and the mining supplies and everything else out of the car. And the story is that after everything was out and the doors were closed, she pulled out the shotgun that she carried everywhere and patted it on the hood and shot it, and then just left it there.
Okay, any other questions or comments?
I have actually kind of a two-parter. I was interested in how many of the women that you've researched went west or came into Nevada anyway with their husbands, and how many came in as single women?
Mike, that's a great question. It comes back to Eric's question with patterns. Often, I can't find these women actually living with a man. And of course, with census data being 10 years apart, that it's hard to make those assumptions. But it does seem that many of these women needed a job and created their job. They were not relying on a man for support. But other women, I mentioned Mae Williams, the woman who died after the mining accident. She lived with a partner, and the word partner was used. Maybe it has a 21st century meaning, or maybe it literally was just a business partner. But it is an interesting pattern to find that many of these women were unattached, and often would use Mrs., but you can't find the Mr. in the records.
But the second part relates to your use of newspaper sources, and I was kind of wondering. A colleague of mine is working on a recently rediscovered little Cornish cemetery in Pennsylvania, and these people were all working at the zinc mines originally, and then around the 1890s, a lot of them moved west. But there's about 16 graves here, so one of the sources that he's been using are newspapers to try to find any trace of, the death of the people in the cemetery. And the cemetery has really been abandoned for decades. So I was wondering what he's been using newspapers.com. And I was wondering if you had any other thoughts on newspaper sources or easier ways to use digital sources on newspapers.
I actually find newspapers.com to be one of the easier ways and well worth the subscription price. But I also use newspaperarchives.com. Sometimes there are newspapers there, especially for Nevada, that aren't on newspapers.com. And then there are newspapers through the Library of Congress that are free, and you can do word searches there. I get a little frustrated sometimes trying to chase down my results. But the challenge is that not all newspapers are digitized, and so it can't be, you can't see it as a complete database. Yeah, that's what I tend to find. So thanks, Mike. I see Brian very patiently has his hand in the air, waving it around.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. So I mean, I was interested in the last picture you had of the students, and I was actually gonna ask if I guess I was trying to think of like what happens chronologically here for women. Like, does the mining industry professionalize and more women disappear out of kind of prominent roles in actual mining, or am I just imagining that? Or are there some women who kind of gradually join the Mackey School, for instance? Like, I'm just kind of curious if you had thoughts or if you found anything.
No, thanks. That's a great question, because it seems like I would see more women in mining before what we consider the modern era. If we think of the Carlin trend as essentially the launching the modern era of mining and corporatizing it, you don't see as many women. The small mine operators sort of disappear. With Mackey, the earliest, the data is slipping out of my head, but it seems like there was a woman who was enrolled in a safety course, I want to say around 1905, 1906. But in terms of the full-blown mining engineering program, the first women enrolled in 1938, I think. It was the late 30s. And then in the early 40s, you see several women enrolled there in mining engineering, and then no one until the 50s. And then there's just one or two. So, but definitely the professionalization of the industry shut women out and reduced the number of women who were engaged in mining.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
I've got a comment about that. The first woman to graduate from the Colorado School of Mines was in the 1890s. But I was there in the 1960s, and there were only 2 women in my freshman class. So things hadn't changed a whole lot between 1890 and the 1960s.
Yeah, I think it was a long slog. Mark and Lynn?
Dana, I just recently saw, and had I made the connection with your talk tonight, I would have tried to preserve it. But I just recently saw a photo of 2 female mining engineering students from, I want to say 1927 or thereabouts, at the Wisconsin School of Mines, which later became known as Whiskey Tech down in Platteville. And I know there were several others through the 1930s. What became of them, I don't know. And of course, a lot of the Platteville engineers ended up scattered to the 4 winds and all around the world. So who knows if or where they practiced their trade, but it did happen. The other thing that comes to mind is, and I wish I had more information at hand on this, but there was a mine called the Galena Level near Schultzburg that was operated probably for 70 or 80 years off and on, but in its last iteration, just prior to World War II, 1938, last name escapes me for the moment, but it was Hub and Honey. And Hub was a miner, and apparently he didn't talk much, but Honey ran the mine. She was the management end of it, and apparently she swore like a sailor, and was pretty hard on the staff. And I was fortunate enough to come into possession of her ledger books for that operation some years ago, and she was persnickety with her bookkeeping. What became of them, I don't recall, but they did operate that mine for about 5 or 6 years just prior to World War II. So there were women miners in this district as well.
Yep, I think they're everywhere. Thanks. Jack?
I was the last chief mine engineer at the Kennecott Mines at Ruth in 1978.
I don't know. Well, Ruth, I love the story of Ruth because it is named after an actual woman, although she was very, very young at the time. Her father, D.C. McDonald, made those, located those claims. I'm going to mess up the date now, but right about the time his daughter was born. So I want to say 1896, and Ruth was the name of the daughter. And so that became the name of the town. And what I have always enjoyed about that story is Ruth's mother was Minnie Cummins McDonald, and Minnie's father was the state senator who attempted to get women the right to vote. And it was Minnie's husband, D.C. McDonald, who cast the vote against it, saying that women were too stupid to vote. And I always wondered what Thanksgiving would have been like at that family event. Yeah, there aren't many mining towns named for women in Nevada. And there may be in other states, but in Nevada, there's Ruth and there's Mina are the two that come immediately to mind.
Wasn't Candelaria named for a woman?
Oh, was it?
I thought that was named. Sally tells the story, and I thought it was, but I might have that mixed up. But that one springs to mind possibly too.
Oh, we'll have to look. Yeah, Mina was named, and Sally writes about Mina, Fermina Saras, who was a miner and prospector in Mineral County.
Another problem to find women in mining is the use of their initials, because that,
Yeah.
whether it was to hide that they're women or whatever. My granduncles had a habit of always including their wives as officers in their mining companies, but you wouldn't know it because they were just referred to by their initials. So you had to know that KL was Kathleen, whatever, Patrick, and I forget the other wife right now, but yeah, so at least in the Tonopah and Goldfield business directories, you can't, hard to tell if there are any other women directors, and if they're listed, what their actual involvement was in the mining operations.
Yeah, and Barbara, I think women did that deliberately. If you're trying to sell your prospect, you'd want to attract as much attention as possible and not the wrong kind of attention. But Josephine Guyman, who I mentioned earlier, who ran that mill, all of her claims that are recorded in the Elko County Recorder's Office all say J. Guyman. So there's no Mrs., there's no Josephine, it's just J. Guyman. And if I had started with the claim locations, I might not have noticed that.
Well, thank you very much, Dana.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was fun.